Welcome everybody to our final in the series, History of Israel. And we left off last time with Helen, the mother of the Emperor Constantine, who comes to Israel and takes a tour guide to show her all of the sites associated with Jesus. He takes her to Jerusalem and he shows her where Jesus is crucified and dies and is resurrected. He shows her on the Mount of Olives where the ascension took place. He takes her to Bethlehem and he shows her where Jesus was born. He takes her to Nazareth where he grew up. He takes her around the Sea of Galilee, on the Sea of Galilee, everywhere that something that has to do with Jesus took place. He takes her and she builds a church. This is a thriving period in the land of Israel, perhaps only second to the one in the 21st century, modern days. And it is raining gold on the land of Israel. Churches are being built, prosperity, people are coming, living here. Christianity rules the land for the next 300 years. 7th century, Islam conquers the land. And this is when we start seeing the appearance of mosques. So at this stage, we have the churches for the Christians, we have the synagogues for the Jews, and of course, now we have mosques for the Muslims. Islam is born in modern-day Saudi Arabia, in Mecca and Medina. The Prophet Muhammad is born in Mecca, has to leave, flee. He is ousted actually to Medina. When he believes he has enough power, he comes back to Mecca and takes over. And from that point on, Mecca is the holiest place for the Muslims. There, in fact, is a place called the Kaaba. This is a heavenly stone associated with Muhammad's house that once a year on what we call Ramadan. Ramadan is a month. And on Ramadan, Muslims all over the world try to have a pilgrimage to Mecca. Just like the Jewish people have a pilgrimage to Jerusalem, the Muslims have a pilgrimage to Mecca where they walk around the Kaaba, they walk around this heavenly stone, very holy, important stone. And if they do all of the rituals the right way and at the proper time, they receive this honorary title called Hajj, H-A-J, for lack of a chet in your English language. And Islam conquers about half of the world, including the land of Israel. At this stage, they are already split. Muhammad is already dead. The Umayyad dynasty controls the land of Israel, but they do not control Mecca and Medina. And this poses a problem and a threat to them. Because every time there's a Hajj, every time there is a pilgrimage holiday, they have to allow their people to go to Mecca. And that means 3-5 months that the people are not going to be here. And since Islam just conquered this area from the Christians, who's to say that the Christians won't take the opportunity that the people who support the Umayyad dynasty are not here and try to reconquer this place? They need a place to serve as a replacement for what they're supposed to do in Mecca. Now, I talk about this in my other webinar about the Temple Mount, but on the Temple Mount is the Holy of Holies, the stone that we talked about in the first part of the series of History of Israel. This is the foundation stone. Now, holy to Jews, holy to Christians, holy to Islam. I cannot stress this idea enough. Not everything holy to Islam is holy to Jews and Christians, but if it is holy to Jews, holy to Christians, therefore holy to Islam as well. When I say that Abraham is supposed to take his son and sacrifice him on a specific spot, Christians and Muslims agree. When I say where it was supposed to take place, the Christians and the Muslims will agree. When I say who Abraham was supposed to take, this is where Islam is going to have a difference of opinion when it comes to the person. Jews and Christians will say that the Bible says, well, Abraham took his son Isaac and was supposed to sacrifice him. Islam will say, no, he was supposed to take his firstborn, and that is Ishmael. Why is this important? Because Ishmael is seen as the forefather of Muhammad. And if that is the case, then Muhammad is actually a descendant of Abraham. So Abraham Isaac, Jacob, 12 tribes of Israel. This is how we get to the Jewish people modern day. But if you go from Abraham to Ishmael and go down that line, eventually we are supposed to get to Muhammad. Names in Islam, name in the Arab world are very similar to that in the Jewish world. We have Yusuf, which is Joseph. We have Ibrahim, which is Abraham. We have Musa, which is Moses, and even Isa, which is Jesus, because they see Jesus in Islam as a holy man. They see him as a prophet. He is just not the final prophet as far as Islam is concerned. So the big difference between Judaism, Christianity, Islam is who is the final prophet and what was God's final word to mankind. In Judaism, we believe that it is the Testament. Malachi is the last prophet. Christianity believes in all of what the Jews believe. They just think that Jesus is the last prophet and the New Testament is God's final word. And Islam believes in Jesus as well as a prophet, not as God alive. This is where a huge difference is between Christianity and Islam. They do not accept Jesus as God alive. However, they do see him as a holy and important man, just like Moses was, just like Aaron was, just like all the biblical characters that we know and love. But they say that after Jesus comes Muhammad, and he brought with him the Quran, and this is the last updated version of God's words to mankind. And if there are any discrepancies between the Quran and the other two books, then we follow the Quran. Islam sees Judaism's book and Christianity's books, the Testament and the New Testament, as holy books. They see Jews and Christians as people of the book, but they see Islam and the Quran as the final say. Since they believe that the Jewish text and the Christian text are holy, obviously, all of the events took place. They took place where the Jews and the Christians say they took place. However, it was a different character. Instead of Isaac, we have Ishmael being taken by Abraham and is supposed to be sacrificed to God. And therefore, when the Jewish people say Jerusalem is holy, it becomes automatically holy to Islam as well. And when Jews had a temple on top of the Temple Mount, there's no reason why the Muslims will not have a worshiping place there as well. In fact, that is the reason. Because the Jewish people had a holy site there, that's why Islam also has a holy site there. And they are going to take this. The Umayyad dynasty will take the Jewish holy site on the Temple Mount and make it as a replacement for Mecca. That way, for political reasons, obviously. But these political reasons will bring people to make a pilgrimage instead of to Mecca, to Jerusalem. Today, there's no question, Jerusalem is the third holiest site in Islam after Mecca and Medina. In the 8th century, because of the political issues, there was a debate whether Jerusalem, the site that Muhammad as a prophet ascended to the heavens to God, to see God, is holier than Mecca. No debate today anymore. The Muslim period lasts for about 400 years. And in the 11th century, the Christians are going to make their way back to the land of Israel. It is the end of the 11th century. 1091, the call comes out. They have to prepare. They have to bring supplies. It's a long walk to the Holy Land. And they are going to conquer Jerusalem in 1099. They create a kingdom, they appoint a king, Baldwin I is the king, and for the next almost 100 years, they are going to rule until Islam, again, is going to take over around the end of the 12th century. It doesn't last long. The Christians come back again, and they conquer the land of Israel, but not all of it. They only conquered the northern half, without Jerusalem, without Bethlehem, without the entire south of the land. And that poses a problem. When there is Christmas, for example, they want to celebrate in Bethlehem. So what do? We can't get to Bethlehem. It's not under our control. They create a town. They actually build a town called Bethlehem in the Galilee, and they celebrate Christmas in Bethlehem, just not in original Bethlehem, in Bethlehem in the Galilee. Till this day, we have a town in Israel called Bethlehem in the Galilee in the north of Israel. And there are other sites that they weren't able to reach, like Joseph's Pit, that they decided we're going to name a place up here in the northern part of Israel as the place where this took place. The Christians, even though they conquer only half of the land of Israel, stay here for the next almost again 100 years until Islam finally manages to kick them out. And this time at the end of the 13th century, they managed to kick them out for a long time. At the end of the 13th century, the Christians pack their bags. If they survive, they get into the boats and sail back to Europe. And for the next 500 years, we don't see Christians trying to reclaim the land of Israel. In fact, from the 13th century, almost uninterrupted until the end of World War I, we have some kind of Muslim entity controlling the land of Israel. The last 400 years, from the 16th century until World War I, this is the Ottoman Empire, the Turks. 400 years, the Turkish Empire rules this region. And here's that little episode with Napoleon. At the end of the 18th century, Napoleon has a vision. He wants to circumvent the British-controlled routes of the spices coming in from India into Europe. And he believes that he can create a channel of water between the Red Sea in Eilat, which is a part of the Indian Ocean, through the land masses of Israel and Egypt, create this channel that will lead from the Red Sea, the Indian Ocean, straight to the Mediterranean, and then he'll have a southern access from the Mediterranean towards France and towards the rest of Europe. And in order to create this, or to make this dream come true, he's going to conquer Egypt, which he does, and then he has to conquer the land of Israel as well. Now, the Ottomans are not just going to stand idly by and allow him to do this. They're going to fight over the land. And Napoleon is trying to gather allies. Who better than the Jewish people? And he sends letters to Jewish communities all over Europe, telling them it is time to reconquer their God-given birthright to the land of Israel, or to Palestine as it was called back in those days. And to help him, Napoleon, the Jews will help Napoleon fight the Ottoman Empire, and in return, Napoleon will grant them the rights to live as a free people in the land of Israel, to return to their homeland. Now, the British, of course, don't want Napoleon's actions to come true. They don't want him to circumvent the shipping routes that they have from India to Europe. So they're actually going to ally with the Turks against Napoleon. Napoleon manages to go from Egypt through the south, through the Sinai Peninsula, towards Gaza and Jaffa, conquers these areas, a bloody mess in Jaffa. They describe it as one of the bloodiest battles Napoleon ever fought. And then he makes his way north, all the way to Akko, one of the big strongholds in the land of Israel. And at this point, Admiral Nelson of the British fleet makes his way through the Mediterranean to help the Turks. And together, the Turks and the British manage to defeat Napoleon. He runs back to Egypt, gets into his boats. It was all in all a failed campaign. However, a few things did happen during this episode that Napoleon had here. Number one, he reintroduces the Holy Land to the Christians of Europe. From the end of the 13th century, Israel was kind of a forgotten area. Very few Christians would make pilgrimage to the land here. Almost no Christian lives in the land of Israel, or very few anyway. And the other thing that happens is that they find the Rosetta Stone. Some of you may have heard about the Rosetta Stone. The Rosetta Stone was found in Egypt, not in Israel. Some of the soldiers of Napoleon find this very interesting piece of stone that has inscriptions on it in 3 different languages. And one of them is Latin, which they were able to read. And the other 2 were ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics, basically. This was the key to deciphering hieroglyphics. Hieroglyphics was a dead language until the 18th century, 19th century. And this stone that was found was the key to deciphering it. And a very smart individual, I can never remember his name, Pan Champignon. I can't remember who he was, but he reads the Latin and he sees that at the end of the inscription there is a name. And then he turns to the hieroglyphic part and he sees that there are basically the same amount of characters where the Latin name is mentioned. And he understands that hieroglyphics becomes a phonetic language. What does that mean? It means that instead of every picture describing a word, every picture describes a sound. So let's say we take the first hieroglyphic, which looks like a bull. If you remember the Chicago Bulls emblem, that would be a hieroglyphic. Now, in ancient Hebrew, a bull is aluf. Aluf, that's the actual word for Hebrew for bull. Aluf is where we get the first letter in the Hebrew alphabet, Aleph, Aluf, Aleph. And of course, the sound that it makes is A. And if you look at a square version of writing in English, you will see that the letter A might have some resemblance to this hieroglyphic, and that the first sound that the letter A in the English alphabet and the Latin alphabet makes, the sound is A, just like the Hebrew letter is A. And the second letter is Bait, a picture of a house. Bait is a house. The sound that we get is the sound that a Latin B, the second letter in the Latin alphabet and in the English alphabet has, the sound is B. And the fourth one is D, in Hebrew Dalid. And your M is my Mem, and your N is my Nun, and your L is my Lamed, and your S is my Samech, and your T is my Taf, and so on and so on, so on and so on. We actually find that hieroglyphics is the mother of both Hebrew and Latin alphabets in modern day. Maybe we'll do a special webinar just on Hebrew, ancient Hebrew hieroglyphics and Latin alphabet and how it's all derived. I'll get some pictures from the Israel Museum, and you'll see how it evolves into modern day either Hebrew or English. We have a lot in common as far as we're concerned in alphabet and in language. So this is the 19th century and the failed campaign of Napoleon. The Ottoman Empire is still in control after this failed campaign, but Israel is now reopened for the Christians. And in the 19th century, we see that actually at the beginning of the 19th century, the majority of people living in the land of Israel were actually Christians. There was a minority of Jews and Muslims, but the majority were Christians. And then a lot of things are happening in the 19th century. 1839 was seen by different Jewish communities all over the world using different methods as the year Messiah is coming. Don't ask me why, but that was the year that Messiah was supposed to come according to these Jewish communities. And from all over the Jewish world, we see an immigration of religious Jews into the land. I don't know if you noticed, but in 1839, Messiah did not arrive. Some of the Jews decided to stay in the land of Israel. Some converted from Judaism to either Christianity or to Islam because they were so upset and disappointed that Messiah did not come in 1839, and others left. 1850s and 60s, the Ottoman Empire has a vision. We want to connect Mecca, Medina, the holiest sites for Islam, with Istanbul, with the capital of the Ottoman Empire. We're going to do it with a railroad. And the first railroad to ever be built in this region called nowadays the Middle East was from Jerusalem to Tel Aviv. The first railway stations in Tel Aviv, and well, it wasn't Tel Aviv yet, but it's Jaffa to Jerusalem. What happens when you're building a railway? There's work. People from all over the Ottoman Empire, especially Muslims, are pouring into the land because we are building a railway. And when a lot of people are coming in, it gives the regional governor easy access to their money in terms of taxes. And he can now support the community and he can build more things. And now, towards the end of the 19th century, another thing happens in the Jewish world. We call it Zionism. The idea that the Jewish people should have a home of their own somewhere in the world. They haven't decided yet that it has to be Israel. That will come a little bit later. But we see not just religious Jews making their way into the land of Israel in order to build a state for the Jewish people. And they're building cities, and they're building schools and agricultural schools, and they're creating electrical power stations using the waters of the Jordan River. And they are cultivating the land, and they are um, replanting trees. I haven't talked about this because there's so much to talk about, but in the 19th century, there are almost no trees in the land of Israel. Mark Twain actually comes here to the land of Israel, to the promised land, and he writes about the fact that there are almost no trees during his entire course of touring the land. He mentions about 2 or 3 specific trees because he's so shocked by the fact that there are no trees. It's a combination of the fact that the Ottomans taxed trees. So people would cut down the trees so they don't have to pay the taxes. The Ottomans are building railroads, and that's using trees. They were building houses out of trees. I don't know what they were doing with the trees that they cut down, but they cut almost all of the trees down, and the Jews coming into the land are now trying to cultivate the land, trying to replant trees. They are drying swamplands in the north of the land. They are settling in the most difficult areas of the desert in the land of Israel in order to build the dream, a Jewish state for the Jewish people. And by the end of the 19th century, the situation of the population changes so radically that the Christians who were the majority at the beginning of the 19th century are now the minority. And the Muslims who were a part of the minority are now the majority. And these are Muslims who are coming from all over the Ottoman world. Remember, all they need to do is show that they are Ottoman citizens, and they walk freely between each of the regions. And that brings us to the beginning of the 20th century. The Zionist dream is still alive. We have waves of immigration coming into the land of Israel, continuing to build. And as the Jewish people are building, the Muslims are coming in as well in order to help the Jews build, because there's work in this area. So wherever there's work, that's where the Muslims in the Ottoman world are making their way into. World War I begins, basically a halt of all activity here in the land of Israel. This is a war that does not pass over this part of the world. A lot of things are happening here, but in 1917, before the war is over, we have a signed declaration from the, I guess you would call him the Foreign Affairs Minister of the British Empire. It's called the Balfour Declaration. And the Balfour Declaration basically promises that Her Majesty's or His Majesty's Empire will do everything in their power in order to help the Jewish people build a state for the Jews in biblical Israel. Let me refer you back to our little maps of biblical Israel so we understand what we're talking about. This is one of them. Let's do a different one. Here we have some of the tribes as well. So it allows us to understand what biblical Israel is. And notice all of this area with Gad, Reuven, all of this area, this is biblical Israel. It goes here to the eastern side of the Jordan River and to the western side of the Jordan River. Hopefully you can see what I've just marked down. Now, what the British didn't account for is the fact that the Jews are not exactly the majority in this land. As we said at the beginning of the 20th century or the end of the 19th century, the Muslims are the majority. And this declaration is not sitting well with the Muslims. And riots are starting here. Now, by 1918, the war in the land of Israel is basically over. We're talking about the Great War. That's what it was called back in those days. We didn't have World War II. So in 1919, they couldn't call it World War I. They called it the Great War. So the Great War is over in the land of Israel, and the British and the French split the land, all of the land that they conquered from the Ottoman Empire. Modern day Syria and Lebanon were in the possession of the French. The land of Israel, Egypt, including modern day Jordan, including Saudi Arabia, including India, and all other areas that the British ended up taking over are under what we call the British Mandate and the French Mandate. They created the League of Nations after World War I is over, after the Great War was over. And the League of Nations gives the British and the French, de facto, they give them permission to rule these areas that they took over in the war until the local population can show that they can control the area on their own. And it takes time, but eventually Pakistan and India are free of the British rule. And in the 1940s, we see the French leaving what we call today Syria and Lebanon, and Syria and Lebanon become states. And then we have Saudi Arabia and Egypt as well. Now, it takes another world war for things to kind of sort themselves out here in the land of Israel. And during World War II, the British need allies in this region because the Germans are coming in again from the area of Africa. They're coming in from Morocco towards Egypt, and they're headed over towards the east, towards the land of Israel. And the allies that they found are the Hashemite Kings. This is another story that we're not going to get all the way into, but the Hashemite Kings can show their heritage going back all the way to Muhammad. So as far as the Islamic world is concerned, they are legitimate kings, no matter what anybody says. And they are maybe the only lineage of actual kingship that is still recognized by almost everybody in the Muslim world. They controlled Mecca and Medina once upon a time, and then the modern day kings of Saudi Arabia kicked them out. But the Hashemite kings were very helpful for the British in World War II, and they decided to help them have an area to rule on their own. What are they going to do? They're going to come to the Jews and they're going to tell the Jewish people in the land here, look, we know we promised you both sides of the Jordan River, biblical Israel. But do you think it'll be okay if we give the eastern side of the Jordan River to the Hashemites? And the Jewish leadership says, yes, of course, why not? Sounds good to us. There are almost no Jews living in that area anyway. We don't need that much of land. We'll be fine with just the western side. And that's how Jordan became a state. The British gave them the eastern side of the Jordan River. In the 1970s, the Foreign Affairs Minister of Jordan actually publicly thanks the Jewish state of Israel for helping the Jordanians, the Hashemite kingdom, to keep itself and still be in existence. It was a phenomenal thing. Now, we always had since then a very interesting relationship between the Hashemite kingdom of Jordan and the Jewish state of Israel. And as we progress in our webinars, we'll talk more about modern day Israel and its strategic allies. Jordan is definitely a strategic ally for the Jewish state of Israel. Since its inception, Israel is very thankful for our relationship with the Hashemite kingdom. But that's where Jordan comes in. And already, not exactly half, but almost half of what was promised to the Jews back in 1917 is basically given away. 1930s and 1940s in the land of Israel, we have a lot of riots between the Jews and the Muslims in the area. We have World War II breaking out. The British understand one thing only after living here and trying to control this area of the Middle East for the last 30 years. From 1917, they are here until the end of World War II. What they understand is that they've had enough. They just don't want to be here anymore. They are leaving everywhere. And they go to the now UN, the League of Nations turns to the United Nations, and they go to the UN and they tell them, listen, we are leaving. Do something with this area where the Jews and the Arabs or the Jews and the Muslims are not getting along. The United Nations sends delegations to see what the situation is. And in November 1947, they come up with a plan. It's called the Partition Plan. Let me go back to one of these maps here. This Partition Plan basically says the following. We are going to split this area of the western side of the Jordan River between the people who live here according to population. And since there is a Jewish population, I'm going to mark a line here, somewhere around here in the north of Galilee, going like this along the coastline. Looks like an N, doesn't it? There we go. This is going to be a Jewish area. Now here in the south, there are mostly Jews. All of these areas that I'm marking with this line, let me even put a J here. Mostly Jewish. So this N is going to be a Jewish independent state, including this area right here that we marked with a J. Over here in the middle, let's give it a different color. Here we go. This area here is mostly Muslims. This area is mostly the hilly area. And this area of Jaffa and Ramle and Ramallah and other places. But we have one more issue. What do we do with Jerusalem? This is where Jerusalem is. Inside the city of Jerusalem, there was a majority of Jews. But if you take all the areas surrounding Jerusalem, you had basically a 50-50 evenly matched population of Muslims and Jews. So they decide not to decide. We are going to make Jerusalem an international area controlled by the United Nations and their troops. And because these troops are going to need access to some kind of a port so they can get reinforcements and supplies, over here, Jaffa is going to be an international area as well. Oh, look at that. I'm making almost like glasses. But Jaffa, Jerusalem, international area, and the road between them will be an international area connecting both cities. This is one of the worst plans you could ever think of. Look at the state that the Jewish people were supposed to have. Part of it is over here, unconnected to the other part over here. And in the middle, you have the Muslim state. The Jewish leadership looks at this plan and says, not the best, but we accept. It's half of the half that was left for us. Okay, we already gave half of it to the Jordanians over here. The Jordanians, oh, my handwriting is wonderful with this thing. This is Jordan. And now out of this area here, they want to give us about half, a little bit more than half. But we accept because a little bit is better than nothing. This is what Ben Gurion said. The Muslims are looking at this partition plan and they're saying, what on earth are you talking about? There is a majority of Muslims in this land. And if we zoom out and look at the entire area of the Middle East, there were about at that point, maybe 1.5 million Jews and about 1.1, 1.2 billion Muslims. Why on earth should there be a Jewish anything in the middle of the Muslim world? And the Muslims refuse. They do not accept the partition plan of the United Nations. This is when a war basically begins. Now, The British are still here. Just because the United Nations voted on this partition plan doesn't mean that the following day the British left. And as long as the British forces are here in the land of Israel, the Muslim countries surrounding the land of Israel do not dare to attack. They don't want to mess with Britain. They do send supplies. They send some even generals to train maybe the Muslims who live here. So we're basically talking about a civil war between the Muslims who live in the land of Israel and the Jews who live here. Almost evenly matched, even though there is a majority of Muslims. There are about 1.1 million Muslims and about 600,000 Jews in 1947 when the war breaks out. We call it a civil war until the British are going to leave. The British say that they leave on May 15th, 1948. That means about 6 months from November to May, we have a civil war here in the land of Israel. Once the British leave, the day that they leave, the Egyptian forces, they have sort of planes, let's call them, are bombing Tel Aviv. And my grandfather was actually stationed in the area of the coastline, and he was a part of the crew that managed to take down the first Egyptian plane from the sky. So we have a full-blown war starting May 1948. The Jews took the opportunities the day before the British left, and they declared an independent state in the land of Israel. The word "in" is very important. We don't have boundaries. We don't know if we're going to survive. The only thing that changes now is Ben-Gurion, who said a little bit is better than nothing back in 1947 when the United Nations wanted to partition the land. Now he says they don't want us to have anything. Let's try and grab as much as possible. It will take probably 3 webinars to explain why it is that 600,000 Jews not only managed to hold their own against all of the invading armies, and there were anywhere between 7 to 9 armies that invaded the land of Israel. It depends if you take into account the troops that were sent from Yemen and Morocco, and troops from Iran and Iraq and Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, Egypt. They all made their way just as the British leave. And we have another year of a war, even more than a year. From 1948, we have another full-blown war in the land of Israel. This was the longest and the bloodiest war that the Jewish people had to go through. 1% of the Jewish population dies in this war. Now, in absolute numbers, when we say 6,000 Jews died defending the state and during that war, it doesn't sound like a lot. But imagine if we take a big country and take 1% of the people of the United States, okay, out of 350 million, that would be 3.5 million people that would have died, 1%. So as far as Israel is concerned, that was a disaster. But at the end of this war, we signed ceasefire agreements, not peace treaties, ceasefire agreements with our enemies. And the state of Israel is a fact on the ground. Going back to the map, this is an important issue. At this point in time, when we are at the end of 1949, at the end of the war in 1949, this is the situation that we have here. The Jewish people managed to take over all of this area here. I'm going to paint it in black, including this part of the Sea of Galilee, going down this way around here somewhere, half of Jerusalem, going this way and into this part. And over here, this is the city of Gaza that I'm marking right over here. All around this area, this is the border. So all of this that I'm marking now, just going to put lines, this becomes the Jewish state of Israel. Now, what happens here in these two strange places The Jordanians have their troops in this area, and the Egyptians have their troops in this area when we signed ceasefire agreements with them. Since the Egyptians take over the city of Gaza, and this is the main city in this region, they call this area they control the Gaza Strip. Now, the Jordanians, remember this is where Jordan is, they are on the east side of the Jordan River, and therefore, because they have troops here on the western side of the Jordan River, they call this area the West Bank of the Jordan River, or in short, the West Bank. The Egyptians did not give citizenship. They did not give Egyptian citizenship to the people living here in the Gaza Strip. The Jordanians, even though they tried, were not able to give citizenship to the people living here in the West Bank. They militarily controlled this region. We jump ahead to 1967. And in 1967, we have another war. It's called the 6 Days War. It lasts for 6 days and a few hours into the 7th. But just like God created the world in 6 days and rested on the 7th, we like to say that the 6 Days War was 6 days and the Israeli army rested on the 7th day as well. This area is taken over. I say taken over by Israel's army. Now we can call it the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces. This area of the Gaza Strip is taken over by the Israeli Defense Forces. We conquer this area over here. Let's put a C for conquer. This was this was Syrian territory until 1967. This is the Golan Heights, and Israel conquers this from its sovereign ruler from the Syrians. And over here, this is a border between Israel and the Sinai Peninsula, part of Egypt. Israel conquers the Sinai Peninsula from the Egyptians. I use different words for Syrian and Egyptian territories, and I used here when I talk about the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, I talk about taking over. Normally, if we talk about Israeli politics left and right, 1967 is one of the most important issues that people will talk about in terms of left and right politics. Did we conquer the Gaza Strip and the West Bank? Did we liberate it? 3,000 years ago. This is biblical Israel. Jews lived here thousands and thousands of years ago. How can we conquer a place that was ours? It's even called Judea and Samaria. Judea on behalf of the Jewish tribe of Judah. So how can we conquer something that was ours? We are liberating it. We're taking it back. So if you say that we are liberating the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, or the Judea and Samaria area, they wouldn't call it the West Bank on the right side of Israeli politics. Liberating the areas, that would have been right-wing Israelis. If you said that we conquered the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, then normally you would have been on the left side of politics. That's normal politics in Israel. For our sake, I'm just going to say that Israel took over. Instead of Jordanian troops in the West Bank from 1967, we have Israeli troops. Instead of Egyptian troops in the Gaza Strip, we now have Israeli forces in the Gaza Strip. That's the main difference between 1967 or before 1967 and after 1967. And that was the situation roughly until 2005-06, when Israel disengaged from the Gaza Strip. Until then, there was some kind of Israeli military control on those areas. We have another war in 1973. It's called the Yom Kippur War. Another all-out war. This war was the first time that Israel was not able to say, we won. And what happens is that the Egyptians take the opportunity and they say, you lost. They didn't say that they won. They said Israel lost. This was the first time that Israeli soldiers basically gave up and raised the white flag and became prisoners of war. This almost didn't happen at all. In 1948, when they were out of bullets for their weapons, they picked up rocks and kept on fighting. But in 1973, Israel couldn't say decisively, we won. Now, jumping ahead, let's go to 2013, 40 years after the 1973 war. For those of you who remember what was going on in 2013 in Egypt, it was chaos, complete chaos. The president of Egypt was being incarcerated. He was on trial. He dies. The Muslim Brotherhood is supposed to take control over the land there. And through this entire chaos, they stop. And in 2013, they celebrate 40 years to the defeat of Israel. That's how important 1973 was in the Egyptian eyes. Now, let's go back to 1973. The Egyptians say, you lost. I'm going to have a theory here that if this did not happen, we would not have peace with Egypt and therefore would not have peace with the Jordanians. One of the most important aspects in the Arab world, not Muslim world, Arab world, is respect and honor. And when the Jewish population, the 600,000 people that lived here in 1948-49, defeated the Muslim world, the Arab world at large, it was a slight on their honor. And the same thing happened in 1967. The Jewish country of Israel, this tiny little area, managed again to humiliate the Muslim Arab world. And they had to regain their honor. And the only way that you can do that is through a show of force. You need to show that you are stronger than your enemy in order for your enemy to respect you. And when Egypt was able to say Israel lost, they got some of their honor back. They were able to hold their head up high again. And in 1977, Sadat comes to Israel and says, I want peace. And he speaks in front of Israel's parliament. And as a result, in 1979, we signed a peace treaty, not a ceasefire agreement. We signed a peace treaty with the Egyptians. Now, I talked about the very special relationship we had with Jordan, even beforehand, but we never signed a peace treaty with Jordanians because they weren't able to be the first ones. The Jordanian country has a very small population. They are not a big force in terms of oil in the Arab world. The only thing they had going for them is the fact that everybody respected that the kings, the Hashemite kings, are legitimate kings. But they weren't able to be the first ones to sign a peace treaty with the state of Israel. So they had to wait. And once Egypt signed a peace treaty with Israel, it was only a matter of time until the Jordanians did. And in the 1990s, we have a peace treaty with the Jordanians as well. Nobel Prizes are given out to Jimmy Carter for the 1979 peace treaty between Israel and Egypt. Bill Clinton, Bill Clinton, was it? Yes, I think it's Bill Clinton. Back in the 1990s, receives the Nobel Peace Prize when he brings together Yitzhak Rabin and Yasser Arafat of the PLO. And then we have the Jordanian king coming in and signing a peace treaty as well. We have a lot of good things taking place here in 1979 and then in the 1990s again. We believe that peace is in the air, only to see that everything is going to crumble. And in the year 2000 to 2005, we have rockets starting to land in the civilian areas of the state of Israel from Gaza. They're actually launching homemade rockets into the surrounding area of the Gaza Strip. All hell breaks loose. We have something called the First Intifada, end of the 1980s, early 1990s. Second Intifada, the uprise of the Palestinians living in the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. The Second Intifada from 2001 to 2005. very bad things are happening here. We have switching of prime ministers in the state of Israel. We have a left-wing government in the 90s turning into a right-wing government, turning into a left-wing government towards the end of the 90s. And then after this last left-wing government fails to bring peace, Bill Clinton is sitting down with, again, Yasser Arafat, this time in the head of the state in Israel is Ehud Barak. These failed negotiations bring with them another uprising, the Second Intifada. The left government fails to regain control in the following elections. And since then, we basically have a right-wing government controlling the state of Israel since the Second Intifada, basically. We have another war, the Second Lebanese War. I failed to mention that we had the First Lebanese War back in the 1980s, but the Second Lebanese War towards the middle of the 2000s. We have more operations against Gaza, and the PLO fails to hold that area, and Hamas takes over, and it's a whole mess. Hamas doesn't even recognize the right of Israel to exist. Some say that as far as Israel is concerned, it clears up the situation. With the PLO that was in charge, they would talk to us about peace, but launch rockets at us. And Hamas, at least we know that they see us as an enemy. Enemies we know how to handle. They don't want us to live. We're at a state of war, apparently, with Hamas. Things are nowadays, 2021, very strange. We have very strange alliances between Israel and the Arab world right now. Iran is getting stronger. They want nuclear weapons, and that forces different players in the Middle East to reassess the situation. There's the whole Sunni Shiite confrontation within Islam. Iran is a Shiite country. Saudi Arabia is a Sunni country. And therefore, the big protector suddenly becomes Israel. So Saudi Arabia is getting closer to Israel. Peace between Israel and the Arab world is breaking out. In the last few months, we had 4 normalization and peace treaties signed between Israel and the Gulf states, and Morocco now is getting into it, and we're hoping that a few other states are going to fall in line once our government is formed, which we don't really know when that is. And just like that, we have just finished 5,781 years of history, bringing us to 2021. Have a wonderful evening. Good night, everybody. Bye-bye.